Rome at night always had a special charm. The narrow streets, bathed in the yellow glow of lanterns, the shadows of old buildings that seemed to hold centuries of stories within them. Brad Pitt walked aimlessly, enjoying the cool air and rare moments of anonymity. In this city, he was rarely recognized, allowing him to simply be a man, without prying eyes or flashing cameras. He was dressed in a black coat that swayed carelessly in the wind, dark jeans, and leather boots. On his head, a simple baseball cap sat low, partially obscuring his face. The outfit didn't draw attention but gave him a refined, almost cinematic look. At the corner of one of the streets, he noticed a kiosk selling lottery tickets. He had a hobby that few knew about: he liked buying lottery tickets. Not out of greed, but for the thrill of chance, the game of fate. In a world where everything around him was predictable, this felt real. Brad approached the counter, where an elderly vendor with deep wrinkles and faded eyes sat behind the glass. "One ticket," Brad said calmly, handing over the money. The man lazily took the bill, tore off a ticket, and handed it to him. "Good luck," he muttered without even looking up. Brad nodded, slipped the ticket into his pocket, and walked on. He almost forgot about it until the next morning, scrolling through the news on his phone, he saw the headline, "Jackpot, $100,000 winner found." Something in the article caught his attention. The ticket number printed on the screen matched the one in his pocket. He reread the numbers again. No mistake. He had won. The first feeling, mild shock, then a faint smile. Even for someone like him, who had seen plenty of surprises, this was unexpected. He pulled out the ticket, examining it closely, feeling the adrenaline pulse through his veins. It could have been just a lucky break, but something inside told him it wasn't that simple. Glancing around his hotel room, he noticed the windows were slightly open. Brad stepped closer and cautiously looked outside. Below, near the entrance of the hotel, a car with tinted windows was parked. It wasn't moving. The driver was nowhere in sight. He picked up his phone and dialed the number listed in the article to claim the prize. The voice on the other end was too smooth, too polite. "Congratulations, Mr. Pitt," Brad answered shortly. "Yes, Mr. Pitt. We've been expecting your call. Come to our office, and we'll arrange your winnings. You can collect the money immediately. Where is your office located?" "We'll send you the address via SMS," the voice slowed, as if the speaker wanted to say something but held back. "Congratulations again." The call ended. A second later, his phone vibrated. A message popped up with the address. Brad frowned. The office was in an old district of Rome, one he knew well. A place where people preferred not to ask too many questions. His suspicions deepened. He looked at the ticket again. A lottery win should be random, but everything about this felt like someone wanted him to be the winner. He wasn't paranoid, but experience had taught him, if something seems too good to be true, it's a trap. Time to find out who said it. Brad stepped out of the hotel, draping the same black coat over his shoulders. He moved with confidence, but his eyes kept scanning for anything suspicious. The car with tinted windows was gone, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The district where he had been invited wasn't the most welcoming. Narrow streets, graffiti-covered walls, and the occasional passerby with a sullen expression. He reached the building, a 3-story old mansion with peeling paint. A sign on the door read, "Rome Lottery Commission." Brad took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, the air smelled stale, mixed with cheap coffee and a faint trace of cigarettes. The lighting was dim, and the walls bore the marks of old photographs that had long been removed. Behind the counter sat a young woman with an indifferent expression, staring at a computer screen. She gave a small nod and gestured down the hallway. "Go straight ahead, they're waiting for you." Brad frowned. He had expected more excitement. Expected cameras, flashes, a crowd of journalists. But here, everything felt too ordinary. He walked down the corridor and entered a room. The interior was minimalist, a simple wooden desk, a leather chair, a few chairs lined up against the walls. A faint musty smell lingered in the air, and on the desk lay a stack of documents, as if already prepared in advance. Behind the desk sat a man in an expensive suit. Around 50, slicked back hair, clean-shaven face. "Mr. Pitt, have a seat," he said with a smile that felt a little too rehearsed. Brad sat down, his gaze locked on the man. He was calm, his movements precise and controlled, as if he had been in situations like this before. "Congratulations on your win," the man folded his hands on the desk. "However, before you receive the money, we need to ask you a few questions." Brad narrowed his eyes. He didn't like the sound of that. "Questions? About what?" "About your loyalty. About your views on coincidences. About whether you're willing to play by our rules." Silence filled the room. Brad realized he had just crossed a line, one that led to an entirely different kind of game. Brad sat at the table, his expression unchanged. The room was dimly lit, the shadow from the lamp falling across the table where the man in the expensive suit sat, hands folded. Every movement of his was precise, and his voice was steady and uninterrupted, the tone of someone used to controlling the situation. Brad could feel the air in the room growing thicker, as if tension hung in every corner. This wasn't just an interview. This was a test. He leaned back in the chair, still focused, his gaze growing cold and calm, like a chess player calculating his moves. "Loyalty," he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Are you perhaps confusing loyalty with manipulation?" The man didn't respond immediately. Brad watched him, every movement recorded in his mind. The man took a sip of water from his glass before answering. "We vet people, Mr. Pitt. Before we trust someone with money like yours, we need to be sure that you're not just a lucky case. Luck is not something to be trusted. What do you want from me?" Brad tilted his head, as though pausing to think for a second before continuing. "You're hiding something." The silence in the room deepened. The man in the suit seemed to hesitate before responding. He began fiddling with a pen on the table, an odd gesture for such a situation. "We work with those who understand what real wealth is," he finally said, his voice lowering as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. "Mr. Pitt, you probably know that not every win brings happiness. Sometimes, behind it, there are obligations." Brad gave a slight smile, barely noticeable. "Obligations? And who decides what obligations I should take on?" The man fell silent, but this silence was not the peaceful kind, it was ominous, like the beginning of a storm. The room seemed to darken, and Brad felt a chill run down his spine. He stood up and walked to the window, ignoring the man. Through the window, he could see the same street where he had walked just hours ago, brushing the dirt off his shoes. Nothing had changed. The street was still dark and cold, with dim lights only emphasizing the emptiness of the neighborhood. When he returned to the table, the man was still looking at him with the same expression. His gaze was tense but still cautious. It was like a game, but Brad knew he couldn't afford to make a mistake. "I understand," he said, sitting back down in his chair. "So what do you want from me?" The man finally smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was more of a victorious grin, as if he had been waiting for Brad to reach this point. "Very simple," he replied, leaning forward. "We'll give you the money, but in return, you'll work with us. Whoever wins always loses something. That's the rule. We'll teach you how to truly use your winnings, how to turn them into something bigger." Brad knew that everything they were telling him wasn't just a coincidence. He saw before him not just businessmen, but people playing a much larger game. And in this game, the winner was the one who was ready to leave everything behind and step into the shadows. "What are the terms?" Brad asked, showing no sign of worry. The man stood up and walked to the cabinet. He pulled out a small box, carefully placed it in front of Brad. We'll be watching you. Every step. Every decision. And if you prove useful to us, you'll get much more than just money. You'll get access to information that millions dream of. Brad didn't touch the box, but his gaze grew more focused. I've always thought that money was just a way to avoid problems. Now I see it's only the beginning. The man looked at him, and his smile grew wider. This is the beginning of real wealth. The question is, will you understand how it works? The sounds in the room grew muffled, and time seemed to slow down. Brad realized that his life had now changed. He couldn't just take the money and leave. He was now part of something much bigger than mere luck. And, as always, behind every stroke of fortune was its own price. He looked at the box, thought for a few seconds, and then said, "I need time to think." The man nodded and walked toward the door. "You'll have enough time, Mr. Pitt. We always give people time. But remember, time, like money, doesn't always play in your favor." When the door closed behind him, Brad was left alone in the room. There was no panic, no fear in his mind. Just a clear understanding, his life had entered a new, much more dangerous stage. He took the box and, without opening it, placed it in his bag. The time had come, and in this game, there was no room for weakness. The night was as dark as the soul of the city, but Brad knew this was only the beginning. He hadn't yet realized how dangerous and relentless the game he had been drawn into would be. However, he was ready. He had always been ready for change, but this time his intuition told him that this game would be unlike anything he had encountered before. Time passed, and Brad couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He kept thinking about the offer, about the box he had placed in his bag. The man in the suit was right, this wasn't a coincidence. It was something far more complicated, something with much deeper roots than just a lottery win. His thoughts were interrupted by the vibration of his phone. A new SMS appeared on the screen, "Come tomorrow at 11 o'clock. Bring the box." Everything was clear, but his fingers clenched into a fist, as if he could hold on to this secret, not letting it grow any larger. The next morning, at 10:30, Brad was already up, preparing for the meeting. He wore the same black coat, the same shoes that seemed almost irrelevant in this ominous context. Today, his face was calm, but his eyes betrayed the tension. He couldn't afford to make a mistake, but he knew he had to take this step. He drove through the old streets of Rome, where every corner could hide something dangerous. As soon as he arrived at the building, the same girl from before greeted him. There was no surprise in her gaze, it was as though she already knew Brad would be there. He walked into the same room where the man in the expensive suit sat. This time, his smile was wider, but it remained just as fake. "Mr. Pitt, glad to see you," he said, standing up. "We decided that it's time for the next step." Brad silently placed the box on the table, ignoring his words. The man didn't rush to open it. He simply looked at Brad with that familiar gaze, the one he had seen in the eyes of hunters. "We expect certain actions from you," the man continued, sitting back in his chair. "In the coming days, we will work with you, and you will observe how the circumstances around you change." Brad didn't take his eyes off him. His calmness was like ice, and nothing could disturb that balance. Actions? What actions? He knew an answer was coming, but his voice was calm, even slightly mocking. The man smirked. "You'll gain access to information that will allow you not only to earn but also to control. But beyond that, there are a few people you'll need to meet in order to better understand who the players behind this business are." Brad raised an eyebrow. He already felt he was in a situation with no easy way out, but now everything depended on his reaction. "These people won't be friendly," the man continued. "They expect determination from you. And perhaps you won't immediately understand whose side you will end up on in the end. But the choice will always be yours." Brad considered every word. He understood that they weren't just waiting for him to join them. No, their goals were more long-term and complex. Their moves were deliberate and calculated. "And how long are you going to watch?" Brad asked. "You're offering me not just a win, but a game." "Well, I don't play by other people's rules." The man suddenly froze, but then smiled again. "That is the game's rule, Mr. Pitt. The question is, how will you use it?" Silence fell in the room again. Brad felt like he was on the edge. He had to make a choice that could change his whole life. He could turn away, leave, and forget about it, but inside, something was pulling him into this world, a world where money, power, and influence decided everything. He took the box and opened it. Inside was a small flash drive and a black envelope. There was no name or address on the envelope, just a few letters written in blue marker. Brad felt his heart begin to race. This was a signal. A signal being sent to a world where there were no rules. He looked up and met the man's gaze. Without a word, without any unnecessary movement, everything was said in that look. "All right," Brad said, standing up. "I'm ready." The next day, Brad Pitt sat in one of the inconspicuous cafes in the central square of Rome. The whole day felt like it came from another world. The sun shone brightly, its rays dancing on the old buildings. Outside, life went on as always, locals hustling about, drinking coffee, while tourists snapped photos of the Baroque facades. But Brad felt how everything around him seemed like an illusion. He knew he was trapped, but he wasn't yet ready to break free. He held the flash drive that had been handed to him at the meeting. The flash drive was unremarkable, just a small metal object, like many such things that had passed through his hands, but it carried a sense of threat. Brad wasn't a tech expert, but he understood. Within this tiny device was information that could turn everything he knew about his life upside down. It wasn't just a coincidence, and he was beginning to realize that someone had been watching him for a long time, pulling him along like a puppet. Suddenly, he felt someone's gaze on him and looked around. Through the cafe windows, he was being watched. But, as always, he showed no signs of anxiety. He smiled at the waitress, thanked her for the coffee, and stood up slowly. At that moment, his eyes met those of a man standing at the entrance of the cafe. The man wore a long coat that didn't hide his athletic build, and his gaze was cold and impenetrable. The man nodded silently, as if acknowledging his presence but making no move. Brad felt the tension in the air, as though someone were watching every step he took. He put the flash drive into his pocket, but that was enough to realize, he was being followed. Of course, he could have left, but then he wouldn't have been able to finish what he had started. He knew that now his life would never be the same. He quickly stepped outside, walked a few blocks, then turned into a narrow alley. Without looking back, he entered the old building's entrance, where everything was as it had been, peeling paint on the walls, the smell of dampness and mold. This place had been forgotten by most, but not by him. He knew he had to meet someone here, someone who could help him understand what was going on. In the basement, where he waited, it was dark and damp. The floor was covered with dirty linoleum, and the air was thick with the smell of old pipes and mustiness. The walls were scratched, and boxes with unclear contents were scattered in the corners. On one of the tables, a laptop sat, and nearby, there were several old phones and a suitcase that looked too new for this place. The man Brad met was strange. He was of average height, with dark, almost black eyes and a strong accent, but his voice was soft and calm, as if he was used to speaking with people he could easily manipulate. "Did you bring the flash drive?" he asked without lifting his eyes from the screen. Brad silently handed him the flash drive. The man inserted it into the laptop and, without looking away from the screen, spoke again. "This is your insurance. But it won't tell you everything. There are very big people behind this, and their game is much more complicated than you think. We can help you, but only if you're ready to go all the way." Brad felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. His life, as he knew it, was no longer just a game. Now he was part of something much bigger, and he needed to figure out what was hidden behind this world. The more you learn, the less chance there will be to turn back, the man continued, his voice becoming more insistent. What do you want? Do you want to continue this game? Or do you want to walk away and forget everything? Brad looked at him. His heart beat steadily, calmly, as if he were back on a movie set. He already knew that his only choice was to go all the way. He had made his choice. I want to play, he said, his voice as cold as death itself. The man on the screen smiled, but it was not a pleasant smile. We're glad you made the right choice, he said, and the laptop screen began to fill with data. Brad saw a chain of connections, numbers, and names that meant nothing to him, but still made him feel how his life was changing. This was more than just a lottery. It was much deeper. But Brad could no longer stop. Brad stood in the dark room, watching the laptop screen flicker dimly before his eyes. He could feel his world changing, becoming part of something much more complex and dangerous than just a random lottery win. But no matter how things unfolded, he knew he couldn't turn back. There was no way out. The numbers and names he had seen wouldn't leave his mind. It wasn't just a random set of data, it was a carefully constructed network of manipulations, where every name, every transaction led to one more powerful player, standing in the shadows, pulling the strings. His entire life was now part of their scheme. He couldn't figure out who these people were. But one thing was clear, they were watching him, knowing his every move and knowing he wouldn't back down. He was just a pawn in their game, but they also knew he could become a dangerous opponent. Do you realize you've become part of something much larger than you thought? A voice said from behind him. The man he had met in the basement was standing right behind him, holding a phone. I understand that it's dangerous, Brad said, turning to face him. His voice was calm, but determination was evident in his eyes. But I have a question. If I'm part of this, what are my chances of getting out? The man smiled, as if he already knew the answer. The smile was cold and merciless. You have two options, Mr. Pitt, he said, reaching for something from his pocket. You can play by their rules, join them, and remain part of this network, or you can try to break free. But if you decide to fight, be ready for the consequences. These people have no mercy. Brad knew that his choice only made the situation worse. However, internally, he had already made it. He wasn't ready to simply give up. This wasn't just a fight for money or power. It was something more important, something that concerned him personally. He decided it was time to act. He stood up silently, pulled out his phone, and dialed the number he had been given at the previous meeting. On the other end of the line, the same calm voice answered. Mr. Pitt, the voice said, with no surprise, as if they had been expecting his call. Congratulations, you made the right decision. Who's behind this? Brad asked, his voice firm despite the inner anxiety. You'll get the answer soon, came the reply, and the phone clicked as if the person on the other end didn't want to continue the conversation. Brad looked at the man in the room. He stood still, as if preparing for the next phase of the game. All I will say to you, he said, pausing before continuing, is that you must be ready for change. Everything will change soon. After a brief pause, he added, though, perhaps you want to continue the game. But remember, its rules can be very harsh. Brad didn't answer. His mind was already consumed by the information he had just received. He was at the center of a giant web, and now it was his move. But if he made a mistake, the consequences could be deadly. Night was falling in Rome, and lights were beginning to flicker on in the horizon. The city felt alive, full of secrets and untold stories, and Brad felt that he had become part of this story. He just didn't know whose side he would be on when it was all over. Step by step, he walked toward his future, not knowing what lay ahead. One thing was clear, he wasn't ready to give in. In his hands, he didn't just hold a flash drive. It was the key to something greater than just winning a lottery. There was no room for the weak in this game. Brad Pitt was ready for the final bet. And now his life depended on the next move he made.